Welcome to Study Session 4, Domestic Politics and Civil Conflicts or Wars. Introduction. Our discussion in this study session will focus on domestic issues that can generate or lead to conflicts or wars. You will learn about the causes of civil conflicts or wars, as well as about the post-civil conflict or wars consequences. Examples will be drawn from states that have experienced civil conflicts in contemporary international system. Learning objectives. 1. Define the term civil war. 2. Identify the salient issues that cause civil wars. 3. Highlight the characteristics of civil wars. 4. Describe the basic ways in resolving civil wars. Civil war and domestic politics. Civil wars are conflicts that occur within a single country. Wars of this type have actually become more common than international wars in the contemporary world. However, conflict within states is of concern for two reasons. Firstly, and perhaps most obviously, internal conflict can be enormously destructive and long-lasting, taking a large toll on society in terms of life, the breakdown of civilian infrastructure, and enduring conditions of poverty and underdevelopment. Secondly, conflict within states is also a concern because it may provoke conflict between states. It has been observed that between 1990 and the start of 2005, internal armed conflicts over governments, that is civil wars, have been the most common by far. In this period, 112 new civil wars erupted in comparison with only 4 between states. One of the characteristics of civil war is that the average duration of civil wars once they erupt has increased. This means that the number of civil wars underway has exceeded the rate of civil war initiation. Thus, civil wars dominate the global terrain because they start and burn at a higher rate than they end, and they last longer. Let us consider examples of long-lasting and resumed civil wars in Afghanistan, Burundi, Colombia, Congo, Indonesia, Iran, Iraq, Ivory Coast, Liberia, Peru, the Philippines, Rwanda, Sri Lanka, Sudan, Turkey, and Uganda. It is noteworthy to know the characteristics of civil war. They are: civil wars color the entire global terrain because they attract worldwide attention, and because external involvement through the military intervention of one or more foreign countries is increasingly common. Since 1946, about 1/5 of the rising number of civil wars have been internationalized when outside actors have intervened to influence their outcome. Similarly, severity of civil wars is also another characteristic. In other words, the number of lives lost in civil violence has always been very high, and casualties from civil wars since World War II have increased at alarming rates. You must take note that genocide and mass slaughter aimed at reducing the population in a particular region have become commonplace in recent civil wars. For instance, the Rwanda case is clearly illustrated, where the Hutu government arranged a genocidal slaughter resulting in the number of about 500,000 predominantly Tutsis and moderate Hutu people in a matter of weeks. The final characteristic of civil wars is their resistance to negotiated settlement. Making peace is difficult among rival factions that are struggling for power, driven by hatred and poisoned by the inertia of prolonged killing that has become a way of life. To be sure, few domestic enemies fighting in a civil war have succeeded in ending the combat through negotiated compromise at the bargaining table. Causes of civil war. Ethnic hatred. Identity is an intrinsic element of self, encompassing the psychological, physical, social, and spiritual sense of a person's existence. Any threat to this core sense of identity can override rational thought and reasoning. In other words, a sense of security based on a distinctive identity, a wider social recognition of that identity, and effective participation in social, economic, and political processes are the basic needs of all humanity. Much of the internal revolt and ethnic warfare currently sweeping the world is inspired less by political motives and economic aims than it is by deeply rooted ethnic hatreds, waged primarily by irregular militia and private gangs against their neighbors. Extreme ethno-nationalists are people who are prepared to kill and die in large numbers. Relative deprivation or decline in income. Internal violence is a reaction to frustration and relative deprivation. When people's expectation of what they deserve rise more rapidly than their material rewards, the probability of conflict grows. That, of course, applies to most of the countries in the global south today, where the distribution of wealth and opportunities is highly unequal. Furthermore, years of stagnant negative economic growth in poor and middle-income countries have triggered social disturbances as competition for scarce resources, jobs, and other opportunities has heightened. Often in such conditions, the ruling political elite can be undermined as their leadership is challenged in coup d'etat. For example, in Sierra Leone, Captain Valentin Strasser masterminded a coup in 1991, pushing the country into deeper economic decline and eventually war. Liberia, Algeria, and even the Lebanon suffered economic decline in the years preceding internal conflict. The lack of democracy. The absence of democracy is another condition that may promote civil war, especially for wars that stem from ethnic or religious conflicts. A group's lack of democratic rights can threaten the core of its ethnic identity and reduce the possibility of redressing its grievances. However, the greatest risk of civil war comes in countries where the government is neither tough enough to repress effectively nor democratic enough to satisfy grievances. Demographic stress. A number of demographic factors contribute to and collectively combine to precipitate civil wars. Among them, several characteristics stand out as powerful: high proportions of young adults, rapid urban population growth, diminishing per capita supplies of cropland and fresh water, and high rates of death among working-age adults. Countries with a high proportion of adults under 30 years have 2.5 times the probability of experiencing a new outbreak of civil conflict as do those with more mature structures relative to population size. Geopolitical environmental factors. The probability of a country undergoing civil strife is affected by key characteristics of its geographic preconditions, such as low supplies of cropland and fresh water. For instance, if a country is mountainous and has a large, lightly populated hinterland, it faces an enhanced risk of rebellion. Also, the geographic location of rich natural resources influences the outbreaks of civil wars. Put rightly, when valuable natural resources are discovered in a particular region of a country, the people living in such localities suddenly have an economic incentive to secede violently if necessary. Conflict is also more likely in countries that depend heavily on natural resources for their export earnings, in part because rebel groups can extort the gains from this trade to finance their operations. Features of civil war. Secessionist revolts. The seeds of civil strife are often sown by national independence movements. Most rebellions have been driven by the quest through guerrilla warfare to win broad public support, created a political wing, present an alternative system of governing, and build international legitimacy. Failed states. Internal wars can be both the cause and consequence of failed states. Failed states mean states that are internationally recognized, but whose governments, if they exist, cannot provide their citizens with even the minimum level of security and well-being of sovereign states. It is very important to know that the proliferation of failing states is a growing global danger. because the civil wars that was caused by state failure leads to waves in immigrants, famine, disease, drug trafficking, and terrorism. Essentially, the causes of state failure and civil disintegration are multiple, but failed states share some key characteristics that make them vulnerable to disintegration and civil war. Some of these characteristics include poor democracies that do not improve living standards are exceptionally vulnerable to civil war. A strong predictor of state failure is poverty, but extreme income and gender inequality within countries are even better warning signs. The failing states most vulnerable to internal rebellion are ruled by corrupt governments widely regarded as illegitimate and ineffective. The best predictor of state failure is high infant mortality. The existence of youth bulge, a large proportion of young adults in the population, increases the risk of state failure through war because large pools of underemployed youth are easily mobilized into military action. Mechanisms for resolving civil wars. It has been observed that civil wars are costly and destructive. Similarly, war does not erupt overnight. In this sense, it will be reasonable to embark on early warning mechanisms in preventing the escalation of civil war. Early warning is concerned with forecasting the potential for the escalation of internal conflicts. In other words, predictions about crisis will be a part of the system, but the aim is to help avert the initial development of a crisis. However, inasmuch as war is an inevitable phenomenon, it should be resolved or brought to a peaceful end. In this regard, an enabling and conducive environment should be created to enable the main actors, including the armed groups or rebels, to participate under a neutral third-party mediator. It is only peaceful resolution of internal conflicts or civil wars that bring about desired peace and political stability needed for socio-economic development. Summary of study session. In this study session, we examine what civil war is and describe the basic characteristics of civil war. Our aim in doing so was to enable us understand the causes of civil war and the mechanism to employ in resolving the salient issues which trigger civil war. We have come to the end of study session 4. Thank you.